Chapter 1. Welcome to Rome. Picture this. It's a warm morning in the year 150 CE, and you're standing on one of the 7 hills of Rome, looking down at the greatest city the world has ever known. The sun is just rising, casting a golden glow over red-tiled roofs, marble temples, and bustling streets that stretch as far as the eye can see. This is Rome at its peak, home to over 1 million people from every corner of the known world. Take a deep breath of that morning air, though you might want to hold a bit, because ancient Rome had its own unique scent. It's a mixture of bread baking, incense from temples, the earthy smell of the Tiber River, and well, let's just say sanitation wasn't quite what it is today. But don't worry, the Romans were actually pretty innovative when it came to staying clean, as we'll discover together. Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say, and by our time period, it had been growing for nearly 900 years. What started as a small settlement of shepherds and farmers had become the beating heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Middle East, and all roads, quite literally, led here. The city itself was a marvel of engineering and organization. Massive aqueducts brought fresh mountain water from miles away, flowing into fountains, public baths, and even some wealthy homes. The streets were paved with stone, and while they could get pretty crowded and noisy, they were generally safer than most cities of the ancient world. At night, torches and oil lamps flickered in windows and doorways, giving the city a warm amber glow. But Rome wasn't just about impressive buildings and engineering feats. It was about people, lots and lots of people. There were senators in their pristine white togas debating in the forum, merchants hawking everything from British wool to Chinese silk, gladiators training for their next bout, slaves carrying water jars on their shoulders, and children playing games in the streets that kids still play today. The social structure was like a pyramid, with the emperor at the very top, followed by senators and wealthy patricians, then the middle-class plebeians, the freedmen who had been slaves but earned their liberty, and finally the slaves at the bottom. But here's the thing, this wasn't necessarily where you stayed forever. Rome was surprisingly mobile for its time. A clever slave could buy his freedom, a successful merchant could rise in society, and even a provincial boy from the edges of the empire could eventually become emperor. The Romans loved their traditions, but they were also incredibly practical. They borrowed the best ideas from everyone they encountered: Greek philosophy and art, Celtic metalworking, Egyptian medicine, Persian spices. This made Rome a fascinating melting pot, where you might hear a dozen languages spoken on a single street corner. As we settle in for our journey through daily Roman life, imagine yourself as an invisible observer, able to wander freely through marble halls and modest apartments, grand villas and crowded shops. We'll share meals with Roman families, relax in their bathhouses, attend their festivals, and even peek into their bedrooms to see how they slept. The Romans had a saying, "Carpe diem," seize the day. But tonight, we're going to see something even better. The chance to step back in time and experience life in the ancient world's greatest city. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin our gentle journey through the cobblestone streets of eternal Rome. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over those 7 hills, just as it has for thousands of years. But tonight, we get to see it through Roman eyes in Roman time, when the world was young and full of wonders we're only just beginning to explore. Hashtag Chapter 2, the Roman house, from huts to mansions. Let's start our day by stepping inside a Roman home. But which home should we choose? Rome was a city of incredible contrasts, where a senator's mansion might sit just a few streets away from a 6-story apartment building packed with dozens of families. If you were wealthy, let's say you're a successful merchant or maybe a retired general, you'd live in a domus, a private house built around a central courtyard. Walking to the front door, past the doorkeeper, usually a slave whose main job was to keep unwanted visitors out, you'd enter the atrium. This was the heart of the house, a large room with a rectangular opening in the ceiling that let in light, and collected rainwater in a shallow pool below. The atrium was where the family displayed their wealth and status. Painted walls showed scenes from mythology or daily life, often in rich reds and golds that would make your living room look pretty plain by comparison. Portrait busts of important ancestors lined the walls. The Romans were very big on honoring their families and wanted everyone to know about their distinguished relatives. From the atrium, you'd walk through to the tablinum, which was like a combination office and reception room, where the head of the household conducted business. Beyond that lay the real prize, the garden courtyard or peristyle. This was an oasis of calm with columns, fountains, flowers, and often beautiful mosaics on the floor, depicting everything from sea creatures to geometric patterns. Some wealthy Romans even had small libraries attached to their gardens, where they could read the latest scrolls from Greek philosophers or Roman poets. The bedrooms were surprisingly small and simple. Romans didn't spend much time in private rooms during the day. They preferred to be out in the public spaces of their homes or in the city itself. Beds were usually made of wood with leather or rope supports, topped with mattresses stuffed with wool, feathers, or if you couldn't afford those, hay or straw. But most Romans didn't live like this. The majority of the city's population crowded into insulae, apartment buildings that could be 4 to 6 stories tall. These were the ancient equivalent of tenement buildings, and life in them could be pretty challenging. The higher up you lived, the cheaper the rent, but also the more dangerous it was. Fires were common, and if you lived on the top floor, you had a long way to fall if the building collapsed, which happened more often than anyone would like. The ground floor apartments were the nicest, often occupied by shopkeepers who ran their businesses in the front rooms and lived in the back. But as you climbed the stairs, the apartments got smaller, darker, and more crowded. A typical family might live in just 1 or 2 rooms, with no running water, no heating except for small charcoal braziers, and no cooking facilities. Many people bought their meals from street vendors or small shops, since cooking indoors was both difficult and dangerous. The poorest Romans lived in single rooms under the stairs or in basements. Sometimes entire families crowded into spaces smaller than a modern walk-in closet. But even these humble dwellings had their charms. Windows might be decorated with flower boxes, and neighbors often became like extended family, sharing meals and looking after each other's children. Roman houses didn't have glass windows. Glass was expensive and not very clear. Instead, they used wooden shutters or thin sheets of horn or mica to let in light while keeping out wind and rain. Most houses also didn't have chimneys. Smoke from cooking fires or heating braziers just drifted up and found its way out through gaps in the roof or walls. You can imagine how smoky it could get, especially in winter. Furniture was fairly simple by our standards. Tables, chairs, and beds were the basics, often beautifully carved if you could afford it. Storage was in wooden chests or built-in cupboards. Romans loved their decorations, though. Colorful wall paintings, intricate mosaics, bronze and marble statues, and elaborate oil lamps that provided light after dark. One thing that might surprise you, Romans didn't have separate dining rooms in the way we do. Instead, they had a triclinium, a room with 3 couches arranged in a U shape around a low table. People reclined on these couches while eating, propped up on their left elbows. It was considered the civilized way to dine, though it probably took some getting used to. Whether you lived in a grand domus or a simple room in an insula, home was the place where Roman families gathered, where children learned their first lessons, where business was conducted, and where the day began and ended. Tomorrow, we'll follow our Roman neighbors as they step outside and into the bustling streets of the greatest city in the world. Hashtag Chapter 3. Morning rituals, how Romans started their day. The rooster crows somewhere in the distance. Though in Rome, you're more likely to be awakened by the clatter of carts on stone streets, vendors calling out their wares, or the sound of your neighbors getting ready for their day. Romans were early risers. partly by choice and partly by necessity, since they didn't have artificial light that was very good for working after dark. Let's follow Marcus, a middle-class Roman merchant, through his morning routine. He wakes up in his simple bedroom as the first light of dawn filters through the wooden shutters. There's no alarm clock, of course, but Romans had become pretty good at waking up with the sun. Some wealthy people had slaves whose job it was to wake them at the right time, but most people just trained themselves to wake naturally. Marcus sleeps in a tunic. Romans didn't really have pajamas as we know them. Instead, they often slept in a lighter version of what they wore during the day, or sometimes nothing at all if the weather was warm. His bed is fairly comfortable by ancient standards, with a wooden frame, rope supports, and a mattress stuffed with wool. A light blanket keeps him warm on cooler nights. First things first, Marcus needs to relieve himself. If he's lucky enough to live in a house with a private latrine connected to the sewer system, he'll use that. But many Romans had to use a chamber pot, which would later be emptied into the street or into a larger container. Not the most pleasant way to start the day, but Romans were practical about these necessities. Next comes washing up. Romans were actually quite clean by ancient standards, but their morning routine was simpler than their evening bath. Marcus might splash water on his face and hand from a basin, using a sponge or cloth to wipe himself clean. Soap existed but wasn't very common. Instead, Romans used a mixture of oil and a scraping tool called a strigil to clean themselves properly, but that was usually saved for the bathhouse. Getting dressed was a bit of a production. Roman clothing was essentially draped rather than tailored, so it took some skill to put on properly. Marcus starts with his tunic, a simple shirt-like garment that falls to about his knees. Over this, if he's conducting business or appearing in public, he'll put on his toga, that famous draped garment that marked him as a Roman citizen. Now, togas look elegant in movies, but they were actually pretty impractical. They were heavy, hot, difficult to put on correctly, and easy to trip over. A toga was essentially a large semicircle of wool cloth, about 18 feet long and 7 feet wide, that had to be draped over the body in a very specific way. It took practice to wear one gracefully, and wealthy Romans often had slaves whose only job was to help them put their togas on correctly each morning. Most Romans, frankly, didn't wear togas every day. They were required for certain formal occasions and for appearing in court or conducting official business. But for everyday activities, a simple tunic was much more practical. Working-class Romans rarely owned a toga at all. Roman women's clothing was equally elaborate, but different. A Roman matron would start with a tunic, then add a stola, a long dress, and finally a palla, a cloak or shawl, when going out in public. Like men's togas, these garments required careful draping to look proper. Footwear depended on your social status and the occasion. Indoors, Romans often went barefoot or wore simple sandals. Outdoors, they might wear more substantial sandals or closed shoes, especially in bad weather. Roman shoes were quite sophisticated, with different styles for different purposes. Some for walking, some for formal occasions, and some specifically for soldiers. Hair and grooming were important parts of the morning routine, especially for women. Roman hairstyles could be incredibly elaborate, with curls, braids, and complex arrangements held in place with pins, ribbons, and even hairnets. Many wealthy women had slave girls whose primary job was to do hair, and who might be severely punished if they made a mistake with their mistress's elaborate coiffure. Men's grooming was simpler, but still important. Most Roman men were clean-shaven, which meant a daily trip to the barber, or, for the wealthy, having a slave who was skilled with a razor. Roman razors were made of iron or bronze and weren't very sharp by our standards, so shaving could be a somewhat painful experience. Finally, breakfast. Romans didn't eat large morning meals like we might. A typical breakfast was simple: bread dipped in wine or olive oil, maybe some cheese, olives, or fruit if you could afford it. Many Romans didn't eat anything at all in the morning, just drinking water or diluted wine. And with that, Marcus is ready to step out into the Roman day, properly dressed, reasonably clean, and prepared to face whatever business awaits him in the bustling streets of the eternal city. The morning sun is climbing higher, the streets are filling with people, and Rome is coming alive around him. Hashtag chapter 4. Clothing and fashion. Dressing like a Roman. Now that we've got our Roman friend Marcus dressed and ready for the day, let's take a closer look at Roman fashion. You might think of Roman clothing as simple white sheets draped over people, but Roman fashion was actually quite sophisticated and varied, with different styles showing your social status, occupation, and even your political affiliations. The basic building block of Roman clothing was a tunic, worn by both men and women. Think of it as a simple t-shirt, but longer and made of wool, linen, or if you were very wealthy, silk imported from China. A man's tunic typically fell to his knees, while a woman's might reach her ankles. The quality of the fabric and the decorations on it told everyone a lot about who you were. For Roman men, the tunic was just the beginning. Over went the toga, that famous symbol of Roman citizenship. But here's something movies don't usually show you. The toga was a serious piece of engineering, made from a semicircular piece of wool cloth about 18 feet long. It weighed around 20 pounds when properly draped. Putting one on correctly was an art form that could take years to master. The way you wore your toga sent messages. If you were running for political office, you wore a toga candida, specially whitened with chalk to show your purity and seriousness. If you were in mourning, your toga was dark-colored. Young boys wore a toga with a purple stripe until they came of age, when they ceremonially put on the plain white toga of adult citizenship. But here's the thing Romans don't want you to know. Most of them found togas incredibly annoying. They were hot, heavy, hard to move in, and easy to trip over. You couldn't do any real work while wearing one, and they got dirty easily. So while every Roman citizen technically had the right to wear a toga, many chose to wear just their tunics for everyday activities, saving the toga for formal occasions, court appearances, and important business meetings. Roman women's fashion was equally complex, but more practical, over their basic tunics. Married women wore a stola, a long dress that showed their respectability. The stola was often beautifully decorated with embroidery, colored borders, and jewelry. Over this, when going out, they would wear a palla, essentially a large rectangular cloak that could be draped over the head and shoulders for modesty and protection from the weather. Colors told stories in Roman clothing. Purple was the most prestigious color because the dye was incredibly expensive. It came from murex shells found in the Mediterranean, and it took thousands of shells to produce just a small amount of dye. Only the very wealthy could afford deep purple clothing, and emperors eventually claimed certain shades of purple for themselves alone. Wearing the wrong shade of purple could literally be a crime. Red was popular and more affordable, made from various sources including insects and plants. Blues came from woad or indigo, yellows from saffron or other plants, and various browns and oranges from different sources. The brighter and more vibrant the color, the more expensive it was. So the rich literally wore their wealth. Roman shoes were surprisingly sophisticated. For everyday wear, Romans preferred sandals made of leather, with different styles for different occasions. Indoor sandals were simple and comfortable. Outdoor sandals were more substantial, with thicker soles and better protection. For bad weather, Romans had closed shoes that looked quite modern. Military sandals, called calligi, were studded with iron nails for better grip and durability. The Emperor Caligula got his nickname because he wore these military boots as a child. Jewelry was hugely popular among those who could afford it. Roman women wore necklaces, bracelets, earrings, rings, and even ankle bracelets. Men typically wore signet rings and sometimes fibulae, decorative pins used to fasten their clothes. The wealthy showed off with jewelry made of gold and precious stones, while the middle classes made do with silver or bronze pieces. Hair was almost as important as clothing in Roman society. Women's hairstyles were incredibly elaborate, especially among the upper classes. Think of towering arrangements of curls, braids, and waves, held in place with pins, ribbons, and even wire frames. Some Roman women wore wigs made from hair imported from Germany, where blonde hair was prized as exotic. Hair ornaments could include gold pins, pearls, and small sculptures. Men's hair was generally shorter and simpler, but still carefully styled. Most Roman men were clean-shaven, which meant daily visits to the barbershop for anyone who could afford it. Barbershops were important social centers where men gathered to hear news, gossip, and discuss politics while getting their daily shave. Children dressed like miniature adults, but with some special touches. Boys wore a bulla, a gold or leather amulet, around their necks until they reached adulthood. Girls had their own protective amulets and wore their hair in special styles that marked them as children rather than women. What's fascinating is how practical Roman clothing could be despite its apparent complexity. Tunics were comfortable and allowed for easy movement. Cloaks provided warmth and weather protection. Sandals were perfect for the Mediterranean climate. The clothing was designed for a society that spent much of its time outdoors, walking considerable distances, and engaging in social activities where appearance mattered. As the Roman day continues, our well-dressed citizens are ready to face whatever awaits them in the forum, the bathhouses, or the busy streets of their remarkable city. Hashtag Chapter 5. Roman food. What's for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Let's follow our noses to one of the most delightful aspects of Roman life, the food. Roman cuisine was far more sophisticated and varied than you might expect, ranging from simple peasant meals to elaborate feasts that could last for hours. The Romans were enthusiastic about eating, and they approached food with the same creativity and enthusiasm they brought to everything else. The Roman day typically included 3 meals, though they weren't quite the same as our modern breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The first meal, called ientaculum, was usually light. Think of it as grabbing a quick bite before heading out. This might be bread dipped in wine or olive oil, perhaps with some cheese, olives, or fruit. Many Romans skipped this meal entirely, especially working people who couldn't afford to spend time on morning food. The midday meal, called prandium, was also fairly simple for most people. This was when you might stop at a thermopolium, essentially an ancient fast food restaurant, for a quick bowl of stew, some bread, and maybe a cup of diluted wine. These establishments were everywhere in Rome, with large clay pots built into marble counters, keeping food warm and ready to serve. Archaeological excavations have found hundreds of these ancient snack bars throughout the city. But the main event was the evening meal, called cena. This was when Roman families came together, when business was conducted over food, and when the wealthy showed off their prosperity. Cena could be anything from a simple family meal of bread, vegetables, and maybe some meat or fish, to an elaborate banquet with multiple courses served over several hours. Roman bread was the foundation of most meals. It was much denser and darker than modern bread, made from various grains including wheat, barley, and millet. The quality of your bread said a lot about your social status. The wealthy ate fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour. The middle classes made do with darker bread that included more of the grain. The poor ate bread made from whatever grains they could afford, sometimes mixed with beans or other legumes to stretch the food further. Romans loved their wine, but they almost never drank it straight. Wine was typically mixed with water, sometimes as much as 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This made it safer to drink than plain water, which could carry diseases, while avoiding the problems of drinking strong alcohol throughout the day. They also added spices, honey, or even seawater to their wine to create different flavors. Meat was a luxury for most Romans. When they could afford it, they ate pork, lamb, goat, and chicken. Beef was less common because cattle were more valuable as work animals. Romans also ate a lot of seafood, fresh fish if you lived near the coast, and preserved fish sauce if you didn't. This sauce, called garum, was made from fermented fish entrails and was used the way we might use salt or soy sauce today. It sounds terrible, but it was apparently delicious and was shipped all over the empire. Vegetables were a major part of the Roman diet. They grew cabbage, turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, leeks, and various greens. Beans and lentils were protein-rich staples. Romans were also fond of eggs, cheese, and various nuts and fruits. Apples, pears, grapes, figs, and dates were common, along with more exotic fruits imported from distant parts of the empire. Roman cooking techniques were quite sophisticated. They could boil, roast, bake, fry, and steam food. They had ovens, both for bread making and for cooking other dishes. Wealthy households had elaborate kitchens with multiple hearths, extensive storage areas, and teams of skilled cooks. These kitchens might produce dishes like roasted peacock stuffed with smaller birds, elaborate pies filled with various meats, or delicate pastries sweetened with honey. Speaking of honey, Romans didn't have sugar. Honey was their primary sweetener, along with concentrated grape syrup called defrutum. This made Roman desserts quite different from what we're used to, but they were still delicious. Romans made honey cakes, fruit tarts, and various sweetbreads that would make your mouth water. Roman dining etiquette was quite formal, at least among the upper classes. People reclined on couches while eating, propped up on their left elbows, eating with their right hands. There were no forks. Romans ate with their fingers, spoons, and knives. Proper table manners were very important, and there were strict rules about how to behave during meals. The wealthy loved their dinner parties, which could be incredibly elaborate affairs. These might include entertainment between courses, musicians, dancers, acrobats, or poetry recitations. Some Roman hosts competed to see who could serve the most exotic dishes, leading to some pretty wild creations like dormice stuffed with nuts or flamingo tongues served as delicacies. But for most Romans, meals were simpler affairs. A typical family dinner might include a thick stew made with vegetables and whatever meat they could afford, served with bread and watered wine. Olive oil was used for cooking and as a condiment. Cheese and egg provided protein. Seasonal fruits and vegetables added variety to the diet. Romans also loved their snacks and street food. Vendors sold everything from roasted nuts and olives to small meat pies and sweet cakes. Markets were full of foods from all over the empire: Spanish olive oil, British oysters, German beer, spices from India, silk route delicacies, and wine from Gaul. As night falls over Rome and families gather for their evening meals, the city fills with the wonderful aromas of cooking food, the sound of conversation and laughter, and the warm glow of oil lamps illuminating dinner tables throughout the eternal city. Hashtag Chapter 6. The Roman Kitchen. Cooking in ancient times. Step with me into a Roman kitchen and prepare to be surprised. Far from the primitive cooking arrangements you might imagine, Roman kitchens could be quite sophisticated, especially in wealthy households. Though the equipment was different from what we use today, Roman cooks were remarkably creative and skilled. A typical Roman kitchen was usually located away from the main living areas of the house, partly to keep cooking smells and smoke from bothering the family, and partly because of fire danger. In apartment buildings, many people had no kitchen at all. They bought prepared food from street vendors or small shops, or used communal cooking areas. But in a proper Roman domus, the kitchen, called a culina, was a busy and important space. The heart of the kitchen was a hearth, not just a simple fireplace, but often an elaborate construction with multiple cooking surfaces. Some Roman stoves had raised platforms with holes where pots could be set over individual fires, much like a modern gas range. The cook could control the heat by adjusting the amount of charcoal or would under each pot. Roman cooks had an impressive array of pots, pans, and utensils. They had bronze and iron pots in various sizes, shallow pans for frying, deeper vessels for boiling, and specialized equipment like colanders for draining, mortars and pestles for grinding spices, and sieves for sifting flour. Some wealthy kitchens even had bronze molds for shaping elaborate dishes. Water was crucial for Roman cooking, and kitchens in wealthy homes often had their own supply piped in from the city's aqueduct system. This was a real luxury. Most people had to carry water from public fountains. Roman kitchens also had large storage jars called amphorae for holding wine, olive oil, and garum, that fermented fish sauce they loved so much. Food storage was a constant challenge before refrigeration. Romans used various techniques to keep food fresh and safe. They had cool cellars for storing wine and some perishables. Salt was used extensively for preserving meat and fish. Olive oil could preserve some foods by keeping air away from them. Honey was used not just as a sweetener, but as a preservative. Fruits were dried, vegetables were pickled, and grains were kept in sealed containers to protect them from insects and moisture. Roman cooking techniques were quite advanced. They could achieve different cooking temperatures and had developed various methods for preparing food. Roasting was done on spits over open fires or in enclosed ovens. Boiling and steaming were common for vegetables and grains. They had learned to smoke meats and fish, both for flavor and preservation. One of the most interesting aspects of Roman cooking was their use of spices and flavorings. Romans loved complex flavors and used spices imported from all over the known world. Black pepper from India was so valuable it was sometimes used as currency. They used coriander, cumin, fennel, dill, mint, and many other herbs and spices. They also made extensive use of various vinegars and wine reductions to add flavor to their dishes. Roman baking was quite sophisticated. They had ovens that could maintain steady temperatures for baking bread, pastries, and other dishes. Some Roman bakeries used techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern commercial bakery. They had different types of flour for different purposes and had mastered various fermentation techniques. The Romans were also early pioneers of what we might call fusion cuisine. As the empire expanded, Roman cooks incorporated ingredients and techniques from conquered territories. They adopted Germanic beer-making techniques, learned about new vegetables from Gaul, imported spices from Asia, and even experimented with foods from Britain, though Roman writers complained that British cuisine was pretty terrible. Wealthy Roman households employed specialized kitchen staff. There might be a head cook who planned menus and supervised preparation, bakers who specialized in bread and pastries, and various assistants who did the routine work of chopping, grinding, and cleaning. Some households even had tasters whose job was to ensure the food wasn't poisoned, a real concern for prominent Romans who had political enemies. Cooking was considered a valuable skill, and good cooks were highly prized. Some kitchen slaves could earn their freedom through their culinary talents, and a few even became famous throughout the empire for their abilities. We have cookbooks from Roman times, including one by a cook named Apicius that gives us detailed recipes and cooking instructions. Roman recipes could be quite elaborate. They made dishes like stuffed dormice, roasted peacock with feathers arranged to look like it was still alive, and various pies filled with multiple types of meat and exotic ingredients. But they also prepared simpler fare: stews, roasted meats, fresh vegetables, and various grain-based dishes that would seem quite familiar to us today. Kitchen gardens were common. Even in the city, many Roman houses had small plots where they grew herbs, vegetables, and sometimes fruit trees. Even apartment dwellers might keep pots of herbs on their windowsills or in small courtyard spaces. The Romans also developed early forms of what we might call processed foods. They made various types of sausages, cheese, preserved fruits, and concentrated flavor enhancers. Roman soldiers carried hardtack-style biscuits that could last for months without spoiling. As the sun sets over our Roman kitchen, the cook is preparing the evening meal, the wonderful aromas of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air, and the household preparing to gather around a table for another delicious Roman feast. Hashtag Chapter 7. Public baths, the social hub of Roman life. Now let's visit one of the most important and enjoyable parts of Roman daily life. The public baths, or thermae. If you want to understand Roman society, you need to understand the baths, because they were so much more than just places to get clean. They were social clubs, business centers, exercise facilities, libraries, and meeting places all rolled into one magnificent complex. Imagine walking into the baths of Caracalla, one of Rome's grandest public bath complexes. You're immediately struck by the sheer size of the place. It could accommodate over 1,500 bathers at once and covered an area equivalent to several city blocks. The architecture is breathtaking, with soaring vaulted ceilings, beautiful mosaics, marble columns, and statues everywhere you look. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with a smaller neighborhood bathhouse to understand how these places worked. You pay a small entrance fee, just a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, so even fairly poor citizens could afford to bathe regularly. The fee might be a bit more for women or at fancier establishments, but public bathing was considered so important to public health and Roman civilization that it was kept affordable. First, you enter the apoditerium, the changing room. Here you undress and leave your clothes with an attendant. Theft was a constant problem, so you want to tip the attendant well to make sure your tunic was still there when you got back. Some people brought slaves to guard their belongings, while others just didn't bring anything valuable. The Roman bathing process followed a specific sequence designed to clean your body thoroughly while being relaxing and social. You'd start in the tepidarium, a warm room that helped your body adjust to the heat. This room was heated to a comfortable temperature and was a great place for conversation. Romans loved to chat while they bathed, discussing politics, business, gossip, or philosophy. From the tepidarium, you'd move to the caldarium, the hot room. This was like a sauna, heated by hot air and steam. The floors and walls were hot to the touch, heated by an ingenious system called a hypocaust. Hot air from furnaces was channeled through spaces on the floors and inside the walls. You'd work up a good sweat here, opening your pores and loosening dirt and oils from your skin. Romans didn't use soap as we know it. Instead, they covered themselves with olive oil, then scraped it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The oil would pick up dirt, sweat, and dead skin, leaving you remarkably clean. Some people brought their own strigils, while others borrowed them from the bathhouse, though you might want to bring your own for hygiene reasons. After the hot room, you'd move to the frigidarium, the cold room, for a shock to your system that was supposed to be very healthy. This room contained a pool of cold water, where you'd take a quick dip. The temperature contrast was invigorating and was thought to improve circulation and general health. But the baths offered much more than just bathing. Large bath complexes included exercise areas where people could wrestle, lift weights, or play ball games. There were swimming pools for those who enjoyed swimming. Some baths had libraries where you could read while relaxing. Others had gardens, art galleries, and even snack bars where you could buy food and drinks. The social aspect of the baths was hugely important. This was where business deals were made, political alliances formed, and gossip spread throughout the city. Rich and poor bathed together, though the wealthy might come with entourages of slaves to attend them, and some bath complexes had separate, more luxurious sections for those who could pay extra. Roman baths were engineering marvels. The hypocaust heating system was incredibly sophisticated, allowing different rooms to be maintained at different temperatures. Aqueducts brought in fresh water, while drains carried away used water. Some bath complexes used millions of gallons of water per day, a testament to Roman engineering skills and their commitment to public health. Bath attendants provided various services. There were masseurs who would rub you down with oils and work out the knots in your muscles. Some baths employed hair pluckers. Yes, Romans were quite concerned with removing unwanted body hair, and this was done by hand with tweezers. Ouch! There were also manicurists, pedicurists, and even people who would clean your ears. Women and men usually bathed at different times or in separate sections of the bathhouse. Women typically bathed in the morning, while men came in the afternoon. This separation was partly for modesty and partly because Roman society was quite segregated by gender in public spaces. The baths were also places where you could show off. Wealthy Romans might bring expensive oils and perfumes, beautiful strigils made of silver, and entourages of well-dressed slaves. Your behavior at the baths said a lot about your social status and personal character. Some bath complexes were enormous entertainment centers. The baths of Diocletian could hold over 3,000 people and included not just bathing facilities but shops, restaurants, libraries, art galleries, and lecture halls. You could easily spend an entire day there bathing, exercising, eating, reading, attending lectures, and socializing. Roman doctors recommended regular bathing for health, and they were probably right. In an age when many people rarely bathed, Romans were remarkably clean and probably healthier because of it. The baths also provided a form of health care. The hot rooms helped with respiratory problems. The exercise areas kept people fit, and the social interaction was good for mental health. As evening approaches and our Roman citizens finish their daily bath, they emerge clean, relaxed, and ready for the rest of their day, having participated in one of the most civilized and enjoyable aspects of Roman daily life. Hashtag Chapter 8. Work and commerce, making a living in Rome. The sun is climbing higher over Rome. It's time to see how Romans made their living in this bustling metropolis. The city was a hive of economic activity, with people engaged in hundreds of different trades and occupations, from senators conducting affairs of state to slaves hauling water jugs. Everyone had their role to play in keeping the great city running. Let's start in the Forum Romanum, the beating heart of Roman commerce and politics. Here, in the shadow of great temples and government buildings, merchants set up stalls selling everything imaginable. You might find a Syrian silk merchant next to a British wool trader, a Spanish olive oil dealer beside someone selling garum from the Black Sea. The Forum was truly international, with goods flowing in from every corner of the empire. Roman commerce was remarkably sophisticated. Merchants used letters of credit that allowed them to do business across the Mediterranean without carrying heavy bags of coins. They had partnerships, corporations, and complex trading relationships that stretched from Britain to India. Ships loaded with goods constantly arrived at Rome's port of Ostia, bringing grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, amber from the Baltic, silk from China, and spices from India. But most Romans worked much closer to home. Rome was a city of small workshops and family businesses. Walk down any street and you'd see carpenters making furniture, blacksmiths forging tools and weapons, potters shaping clay vessels, bakers producing bread, and tailors creating clothing. These craftsmen often lived above or behind their workshops, with their entire families involved in the business. Roman guilds, called collegia, were important social and economic institutions. These were associations of people who worked in the same trade. Bakers had their guild, blacksmiths had theirs, even grave diggers were organized. The guilds provided social support, helped with business matters, and gave working people a voice in city affairs. They also organized festivals, provided insurance for members, and made sure that funerals were properly conducted when members died. Slavery was unfortunately a major part of the Roman economy. Slaves worked in households, on farms, in mines, and in workshops throughout the city. But Roman slavery was different from what we might imagine from later periods. Many slaves were skilled workers who could eventually buy their freedom. Some slaves became wealthy and influential even before gaining their liberty. Freed slaves, called liberti, could become successful merchants, craftsmen, or even advisors to the wealthy and powerful. Women participated in the Roman economy in various ways, though they faced significant legal restrictions. Wealthy women might own property, invest in businesses, and even run their own enterprises. Working-class women worked in family businesses, sold goods in markets, worked as seamstresses or weavers, or provided services like hairdressing or midwifery. Some women became quite successful. We know of female doctors, business owners, and even gladiatrixes. Banking and finance were well developed in Rome. Roman bankers, called argentarii, provided loans, exchanged currencies, and facilitated business transactions. They had offices in the Forum and other commercial areas, and some became extremely wealthy. Romans understood concepts like interest, credit, and investment that we still use today. The building trades were enormous in Rome. The city was constantly under construction, with new temples, public buildings, apartment blocks, and infrastructure projects always underway. This employed thousands of workers, architects, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, painters, and laborers. Some of the most skilled workers were the engineers who built and maintained Rome's famous aqueducts, sewers, and roads. Transportation was a major industry. Rome's location made it a natural hub for trade, and thousands of people worked moving goods and people around the empire. There were ship owners, sailors, cart drivers, porters, and warehouse workers. The city consumed enormous amounts of food and goods that had to be transported from far away, providing employment for countless workers. Rome's government provided employment for many citizens. There were clerks, tax collectors, judges, soldiers, and various administrators. Public works employed many people. Those who maintained the roads, cleaned the public areas, operated the aqueducts, and ran the public baths. Even entertainment was a form of public employment, with gladiators, actors, and athletes performing for the public good. Street vendors were everywhere in Rome, selling hot food, drinks, small manufactured goods, and services. These people often worked very long hours for small profits, but they were an essential part of the city's economy. A Roman street might feature vendors selling sausages, bread, wine, pottery, jewelry, writing materials, and dozens of other items. Professional services were important too. Romans needed lawyers for their complex legal system, doctors for their health, teachers for their children, and architects for their building projects. Some of these professionals became quite wealthy and influential. Roman lawyers, in particular, could become very powerful since legal skill was highly valued in Roman society. Agriculture remained important even in the city. Rome had market gardens within the city limits, and many Romans were involved in processing and selling agricultural products. Millers ground grain, bakers made bread, butchers prepared meat, and wine merchants sold the products of vineyards throughout the empire. The Roman economy was remarkably monetized. Unlike many ancient societies where barter was common, Romans used coins for most transactions. They had a sophisticated system of bronze, silver, and gold coins in various denominations. This made commerce much more flexible and efficient. Working hours varied by occupation, but most Romans worked from dawn to dusk, with breaks during the hottest part of the day. Many businesses closed during the afternoon heat and reopened in the evening. Romans worked 6 days a week, with numerous religious festivals providing days off throughout the year. Roman workers took pride in their craftsmanship and often signed their work or advertised their skills. Mosaicists might include their names in their artwork. Potters marked their vessels, and bakers stamped their bread. Quality and reputation were important for success in Roman business. As our Roman workers continue their daily labor, the great city hums with activity, commerce flowing through its streets like blood through arteries, keeping the eternal city alive and prosperous. Hashtag Chapter 9. Social classes, from slaves to senators. Roman society was like a complex pyramid, with everyone having their place and knowing exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy. But unlike some ancient societies, Roman social structure had some flexibility. With luck, skill, and determination, people could sometimes move up or down the social ladder. Let's explore this fascinating world of senators and slaves, patricians and plebeians. At the very top of Roman society sat the emperor and his family. By our time period, around 150 CE, the emperor wasn't just a political leader. He was almost a god, worshipped throughout the empire and holding absolute power over millions of people. The imperial family lived in unimaginable luxury in their palaces on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by hundreds of servants and protected by the elite Praetorian Guard. Just below the emperor were the senators, about 600 men who formed Rome's most prestigious social class. To be a senator, you needed to own property worth at least 1 million sesterces, an enormous sum that put you among the richest people in the empire. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe, had the best seats at public events, and were addressed with special titles of respect. But being a senator also came with responsibilities and expenses. You were expected to fund public games, build public works, and generally contribute to the welfare of the city. Below the senators were the equites, or knights, wealthy businessmen and landowners who formed Rome's upper middle class. They needed to own property worth at least 400,000 sesterces and wore togas with narrow purple stripe. Many equites made their fortunes in trade, banking, or tax collection. While they couldn't hold the highest political offices, they often wielded considerable influence through their wealth and business connections. The majority of free Roman citizens belonged to the plebeian class. Everyone from small shopkeepers and craftsmen to laborers and farmers. This was an incredibly diverse group, ranging from relatively prosperous merchants to people who struggled to make ends meet. Plebeians could vote in elections, serve in the army, and hold various political offices, though the highest positions were traditionally reserved for the upper classes. Within the plebeian class, there were important distinctions. Some plebeians were quite wealthy and successful, owning their own businesses and living comfortable lives. Others worked as day laborers, earning just enough to survive. Still others depended on the grain dole, free bread distributed by the government to prevent starvation and social unrest. Below the free citizens were the freedmen, or liberti, people who had been slaves but had gained their freedom. This was a unique aspect of Roman society. Slaves could be freed by their masters for various reasons, as a reward for good service, to provide an incentive for others, or sometimes just out of kindness. Freed slaves became Roman citizens, though they faced certain legal restrictions and social prejudices. However, many freedmen became quite successful in business, since they often had skills learned during their slavery and sometimes maintained good relationships with their former masters. At the bottom of the social pyramid were the slaves, who made up perhaps 20 to 30% of Rome's population. Slavery in Rome was different from what we might imagine from later periods in history. Roman slaves came from all over the empire and included people of various races, nationalities, and backgrounds. Many were prisoners of war, but others had been enslaved for debt, born into slavery, or captured by pirates. Roman slaves worked in all kinds of occupations. Some had terrible lives, especially those who worked in mines or on large agricultural estates. But others had relatively good situations. Household slaves in wealthy families might live comfortably, receive education, and eventually gain their freedom. Some slaves became doctors, teachers, accountants, or skilled craftsmen. A few even became wealthy and influential while still technically slaves. The relationship between masters and slaves was complex. Roman law gave masters almost unlimited power over their slaves, but social pressure and practical considerations usually prevented the worst abuses. Slaves were valuable property, after all, and it made sense to treat them well enough to keep them healthy and productive. Many Romans developed genuine affection for their household slaves, and some freed them in their wills. Social mobility existed, but was limited. A successful freedman might become wealthy, and his children would be full citizens. A plebeian with military skill might rise through the army ranks and gain equestrian status. Occasionally, someone from a modest background might even become emperor, though this was extremely rare and usually involved considerable political upheaval. Women's social status was complicated. Legally, women were always under the authority of a male relative, father, husband, or guardian. They couldn't vote, hold office, or conduct certain types of business independently. However, wealthy women often wielded considerable informal power. They could own property, run businesses through male agents, and influence political decisions through their relationships with powerful men. Roman names reflected social status. Citizens had 3 names: praenomen, personal name; nomen, clan name; and cognomen, family name. Slaves typically had only 1 name. When freed, they usually took their former master's nomen as their own, showing their connection to that family. Trainers to teach their sons athletic skills and military techniques. Clothing marked social distinctions clearly. Senators wore togas with broad purple stripes. Equites wore narrow purple stripes, and ordinary citizens wore plain white togas. Slaves wore tunics without togas, and their clothing was typically made of rougher, cheaper materials. The quality and decoration of clothing immediately told everyone your social position. Housing also reflected social status. Senators lived in grand domus with dozens of rooms, beautiful decorations, and large staffs of slaves. Wealthy plebeians might have comfortable houses with few servants. Poor citizens crowded into small apartments in multi-story buildings. Slaves lived in quarters provided by their masters, ranging from comfortable rooms in wealthy households to barracks-like accommodations in larger establishments. Education was another marker of social class. Wealthy Romans received extensive education in rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. Middle-class citizens might get basic schooling in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Slaves received whatever training was needed for their work, and some became quite learned, especially those who worked as teachers or secretaries. But many poor Romans remained illiterate. Social relationships in Rome involved complex webs of patronage and clientage. Wealthy and powerful Romans had clients, people of lower status who received protection, legal help, and financial assistance in exchange for political support and various services. These relationships created networks that connected all levels of society. Despite its inequalities, Roman society provided opportunities for advancement that were unusual in the ancient world. A clever slave might gain freedom and wealth. A successful merchant might enter the equestrian class. And occasionally someone might rise from humble origins to positions of real power and influence. Hashtag Chapter 10. Roman schools and education. How Roman children learned. Let's follow young Marcus Flavius as he makes his way to school on a typical Roman morning. Education in Rome was quite different from what we're used to today, but Romans valued learning and recognized that education was crucial for success in their complex society. Roman education began at home. From their earliest years, children learned from their parents and household slaves. Wealthy families often had Greek slaves who served as tutors and teachers. The Romans greatly admired Greek culture and wanted their children to learn Greek language and philosophy. These household teachers, called pedagogi, were responsible for the children's moral education as well as their academic learning. Formal schooling wasn't free or required by law. Parents had to pay for their children's education, which meant that many poor Roman children received little or no formal schooling. Girls typically received less formal education than boys, though wealthy families often ensured their daughters could read and write. Some women became quite learned, but they were expected to use their education primarily to be better wives and mothers. The first level of Roman education was called the ludus literarius, or primary school. Children typically started around age 6 or 7. The teacher, called a literator or magister, taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Roman schools were simple affairs, often just a single room, sometimes outdoors under a portico, with the teacher sitting on a chair and students on stools or benches around him. Learning to read and write Latin was challenging. Roman books were written on papyrus scrolls without spaces between words, punctuation, or chapter divisions. Students learned by copying passages from famous authors, gradually building up their vocabulary and understanding of grammar. They wrote on wax tablets with metal styluses. The wax could be smoothed over and reused, making it the ancient equivalent of a whiteboard. Roman children also learned basic arithmetic, using an abacus and their fingers. Roman numerals made calculations more difficult than our modern number system, but Romans were skilled at mental math and developed various shortcuts for common calculations. They learned to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and wealthy merchants' children might learn more complex business mathematics. Discipline in Roman schools was strict. Teachers used corporal punishment freely. Beating students with a cane or strap was considered normal and necessary for proper learning. The Romans believed that learning required hard work and that children needed firm discipline to develop proper character. Students who misbehaved or failed to learn their lessons could expect painful consequences. The school days started early and lasted until mid-afternoon, with a break during the hottest part of the day. Students had few holidays. Only the major religious festivals and some market days gave them time off. Roman children didn't have weekends as we know them, though they did have more frequent religious holidays throughout the year than modern students get vacation days. After primary school, around age 12, some students continued to the grammaticus or grammar school. Here they studied literature, poetry, history, and more advanced writing. Students read the great works of Latin and Greek literature, authors like Virgil, Homer, Cicero, and others. They memorized long passages of poetry and learned to analyze the style and meaning of great writings. Grammar school students also studied history, geography, and mythology. Romans believed that knowing the stories of gods and heroes was essential for understanding literature and culture. They learned about the great events of Roman history and the geography of the empire. This education was designed to prepare them to be informed citizens and effective speakers. The highest level of Roman education was rhetoric school, attended only by wealthy boys who were destined for careers in politics or law. Here they learned the art of public speaking, which was absolutely crucial for success in Roman society. Students practiced giving speeches, learned to argue both sides of legal cases, and studied the techniques that made speakers persuasive and effective. Rhetoric students studied under famous teachers who might charge enormous fees for their instruction. They learned not just how to speak well, but how to think clearly, argue logically, and present their ideas convincingly. This education could last several years and might include travel to Athens or other centers of learning to study with the most renowned teachers. Roman education was heavily focused on preparing students for public life. Boys from wealthy families were expected to become lawyers, politicians, or military commanders, all careers that required excellent speaking skills. Even if they planned to go into business, they needed to be able to argue cases in court, negotiate contracts, and persuade customers. Physical education was also important, though less formal than academic learning. Roman boys learned to swim, ride horses, and use weapons. These skills were considered essential for citizens who might need to serve in the army. Some wealthy families employed special. Roman girls from wealthy families often received substantial education at home. They learned to read and write, studied poetry and literature, and were trained in household management. Some women became quite scholarly and wrote poetry or other works, though they were discouraged from pursuing public careers that would use their education directly. Books were expensive and rare. Most Roman books were actually scrolls made of papyrus or parchment, hand-copied by scribes. A single book might cost as much as a skilled worker earned in several months, which meant that libraries were extremely valuable, and most students relied on memorization rather than having their own copies of texts. Roman education emphasized character development as much as academic learning. Students were expected to develop virtues like courage, honesty, discipline, and respect for authority. Teachers used stories from history and mythology to illustrate proper behavior and warn against vice and corruption. Many Romans continued their education throughout their lives. Wealthy adults attended lectures by famous philosophers, participated in literary discussions, and maintained correspondence with learned friends throughout the empire. Education was seen not just as preparation for a career, but as a lifelong pursuit that made people more civilized and virtuous. The Roman education system, despite its limitations and harsh discipline, produced some of the greatest writers, orators, and thinkers in human history. It created a shared culture that helped unite the diverse peoples of the Roman Empire and established educational principles that influenced Western civilization for centuries to come. Hashtag Chapter 11. Entertainment and games, Roman fun and spectacles. The afternoon heat is building in Rome, and it's time for entertainment. Romans loved their leisure time and knew how to have fun on a grand scale. From intimate dinner parties to massive spectacles in the Colosseum, entertainment was a crucial part of Roman life and an important way the government kept the people happy. Let's start with a phrase that sums up what Roman politicians thought the people needed. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't cause political trouble. This wasn't cynicism. Romans genuinely believed that a civilized society should provide both necessities and pleasures for its citizens. The most famous Roman entertainment venue was, of course, the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, which would hold over 50,000 spectators. On the days when games were held there, the entire city buzzed with excitement. People would arrive before dawn to get good seats, bringing cushions, sun hats, and picnic lunches for what could be day-long spectacles. Gladiatorial games were the most popular entertainment in the Colosseum. These weren't just random fights to the death, as movies often portray them. Gladiatorial combat was a sophisticated sport with rules, different fighting styles, and trained athletes who were often celebrities in their own right. Some gladiators became so popular that they had fan clubs, and their portraits were sold on cups, lamps, and other merchandise. Gladiators came from various backgrounds. Some were slaves or prisoners of war forced to fight, but others were free men who chose a profession for the money and fame. A successful gladiator could earn enormous sums and gain his freedom. The very best gladiators were like modern sports stars, wealthy, famous, and adored by fans throughout the empire. The games also featured wild animal hunts, called venations, exotic animals from throughout the empire, lions from Africa, bears from Germany, elephants from India, were brought to Rome for these spectacles. Professional hunters called venators would fight these animals, sometimes in elaborate staged hunts with artificial forests created on the arena floor. But Romans enjoyed many other forms of entertainment. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus was even more popular than gladiatorial games. The Circus Maximus could hold over 250,000 spectators, nearly a quarter of Rome's population. Fans were passionate about their favorite teams, identified by colors: the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Chariot racing was dangerous and exciting, with crashes, spectacular victories, and champion drivers who became incredibly wealthy and famous. Roman theater was also hugely popular. There were several types of dramatic entertainment: serious tragedies based on Greek classics, comedies that made fun of everyday Roman life, and pantomimes, elaborate musical performances where a single actor played multiple roles while dancers and musicians told a story. Roman audiences could be rowdy, cheering for their favorite actors, and even rioting if they didn't like a performance. Public festivals provided entertainment throughout the year. Religious holidays often included processions, sacrifices, public feasts, and various competitions. The government sponsored these events, and they were free for all citizens to attend. Some festivals lasted for days and included multiple types of entertainment. Theatrical performances in the morning, chariot races in the afternoon, and public banquets in the evening. Romans also enjoyed more intimate entertainment. Wealthy Romans hosted elaborate dinner parties that featured not just fine food and wine, but entertainment between courses. This might include musicians playing lyres or flutes, dancers performing, poets reciting their latest works, or philosophers engaging in intellectual discussions. Some hosts hired professional entertainers, while others relied on talented slaves or guests to provide amusement. Board games were popular throughout Roman society. Romans played dice games, a game similar to checkers called calculi, and various games involving boards and moving pieces. Gambling was technically illegal but widely practiced. Romans bet on dice games, chariot races, gladiatorial combats, and almost anything else you could imagine. Children had their own forms of entertainment. Roman children played with toys that would seem familiar today: dolls, balls, hoops, and miniature animals. They played games similar to hide-and-seek, tag, and various ball games. Wealthy children had elaborate toys made of fine materials, while poorer children made do with simpler versions or homemade toys. Roman baths were entertainment centers as well as places for bathing. Large bath complexes included areas for exercise, ball games, wrestling, and socializing. Some baths had libraries where people could read while relaxing. Others featured gardens, art galleries, and rooms where philosophers gave lectures or poets performed their works. Street entertainment was common throughout Rome. Musicians, acrobats, storytellers, and various performers set up in public squares and busy streets. Some were free shows put on by people hoping for tips, while others charged small fees. Roman streets were lively places with constant activity and entertainment. Romans loved festivals and parades. Religious processions could be spectacular events with elaborate floats, costumed participants, and crowds of spectators. Military triumphs, parades celebrating victorious generals, were some of the grandest spectacles in Roman life, featuring captured enemies, exotic animals, wagons full of treasure, and thousands of marching soldiers. Private clubs and associations provided entertainment for their members. Trade guilds held banquets and festivals. Religious groups had their own celebrations. Military veterans associations met regularly for meals and socializing. These organizations gave ordinary Romans opportunities for entertainment and social interaction beyond their immediate families. Roman artists and performers could become quite wealthy and famous. Popular actors, musicians, and athletes were celebrated throughout the empire. Some emperors were performers themselves. Nero famously considered himself a great actor and musician, though audiences were probably too afraid to criticize his performances honestly. Seasonal celebrations marked the Roman calendar. The Saturnalia in December was perhaps the most popular festival, featuring gift-giving, role reversals where slaves could mock their masters, and days of feasting and celebration. Spring festivals celebrated the return of warmer weather, while harvest festivals gave thanks for the year's crops. Romans also enjoyed simple pleasures: walking in gardens, watching street life from taverns, participating in conversations at the barbershop, or just enjoying a cup of wine with friends as the sun set over the eternal city. Entertainment didn't always have to be elaborate or expensive. Romans found joy in everyday social interactions and simple pleasures. As evening approaches and the day's entertainment winds down, Romans return home satisfied by a day filled with spectacle, sport, and social interaction. Essential ingredients in the rich mixture that made Roman life so vibrant and enjoyable. Hashtag Chapter 12. Roman religion and festivals, gods, temples, and sacred days. As the evening light begins to soften over Rome, let's explore one of the most important aspects of Roman life: religion. The Romans were a deeply religious people, though their approach to the gods was quite different from what many of us might expect. Roman religion was practical, public, and closely tied to the success of the state and the well-being of the community. The Roman pantheon was enormous and diverse. At the top were the major gods borrowed and adapted from the Greeks. Jupiter, the king of the gods and god of the sky. Juno, his wife and protector of women. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and warfare. Mars, god of war. Venus, goddess of love, and many others. Each god had specific areas of responsibility, and Romans approached them much like clients approaching powerful patrons, with respect, proper rituals, and expectations of mutual benefit. But Roman religion went far beyond these major deities. Every household had its own gods. The Lauras, who protected the home, the Penates, who guarded the pantry and food supply, and the family's ancestral spirits. Every day began with small offerings to these household gods, a bit of food, a splash of wine, or a pinch of incense burned at the family shrine. These weren't grand gestures, but simple acknowledgments that the gods were part of daily life. Roman temples weren't like modern churches where people gather for weekly services. Instead, they were the gods' houses, where priests maintained eternal fires, made daily offerings, and performed the rituals that kept the gods happy and the city prosperous. The most important temple was the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on Capitoline Hill, where the city's most sacred rituals took place. Roman priests weren't spiritual counselors or teachers in the way we might think of clergy today. They were government officials whose job was to perform the correct rituals at the correct times in the correct manner. The Romans believed that if the rituals were performed properly, the gods would maintain their favor toward Rome. Get the rituals wrong and disaster might follow. The College of Pontiffs, headed by the Pontifex Maximus, supervised Roman religious life. They maintained the sacred calendar, decided when festivals should be held, and ensured that all public religious duties were performed correctly. The emperor himself typically held the title of Pontifex Maximus, emphasizing how closely religion and government were connected. Roman religious festivals filled the calendar and provided structure for the year. Some were solemn occasions dedicated to important gods, while others were joyous celebrations with public feasts, games, and entertainment. The Saturnalia in December was perhaps the most beloved festival, featuring gift-giving, feasting, and a temporary reversal of social roles where slaves could mock their masters without punishment. Spring brought festivals celebrating renewal and fertility. The Floralia honored Flora, goddess of flowers, with colorful processions and theatrical performances. The Perilia celebrated the founding of Rome and protection of flocks and herds. These festivals marked the changing seasons and connected Romans to the agricultural cycles that sustained their civilization. Religious processions were spectacular public events. On important festivals, priests, magistrates, and citizens would march through the city carrying sacred objects, making offerings at various temples, and performing traditional ceremonies. These processions reinforced community identity and reminded everyone of their shared religious obligations. Sacrifice was central to Roman religious practice, but it wasn't as grim as it might sound. Animals were carefully chosen, examined for signs of the gods' approval, and killed humanely by trained priests. The gods received the portions they preferred, usually the organs and fat, while the rest of the meat was distributed to the people for feast meals. These sacrifices were community celebrations as much as religious rituals. Romans were very concerned with reading the will of the gods through various forms of divination. Augurs interpreted the flight patterns of birds, the feeding behavior of sacred chickens, and other natural signs to determine whether the gods approved of proposed actions. Haruspices examined the organs of sacrificed animals for omens. No major public decision was made without consulting these religious specialists. The Roman calendar was full of religious observances. Certain days were considered lucky or unlucky for various activities. Religious law determined when courts could meet, when marriages could be performed, and when armies could march. Romans planned their lives around these sacred rhythms, believing that timing was crucial for success in any endeavor. Mystery religions from the Eastern Mediterranean became increasingly popular in Rome, offering more personal spiritual experiences than traditional Roman religion. Cults of Mithras, Isis, and Sibylle attracted followers who sought individual salvation and mystical experiences. These religions didn't replace traditional Roman worship, but supplemented it, showing how Romans could be flexible in their religious practices. Emperor worship was an important part of Roman religion, especially in the provinces. Dead emperors were often declared gods by the Senate, and temples were built in their honor throughout the empire. Living emperors were worshipped as gods in some eastern provinces, though this was usually more restrained in Rome itself. This wasn't necessarily about the emperor's personal divinity, but about the sacred nature of Roman power and authority. Roman religion was remarkably inclusive. As the empire expanded, Romans encountered new gods and religious practices. Rather than forbidding these foreign religions, Romans often incorporated new deities into their pantheon, identifying foreign gods with Roman ones, or simply adding them to the ever-growing list of gods worthy of respect. This religious flexibility helped Rome govern its diverse empire more successfully. Household religious practices were intimate and personal. Families maintained shrines called lauraria where they honored their household gods with daily offerings. These shrines might include small statues, painted images, or simple niches where offerings could be placed. Children learned religious duties by watching their parent perform these daily rituals. Roman weddings, funerals, and other life events were deeply religious ceremonies. Marriages required proper rituals to ensure the god's blessing on the new family. Funerals included elaborate ceremonies to help the deceased join their ancestors and provide protection for the living. Coming-of-age ceremonies marked young Romans' transition to adult religious responsibilities. Religious festivals provided welcome breaks from work and opportunities for community celebration. During major festivals, shops closed, courts suspended business, and an entire city focused on honoring the gods. These occasions reinforced social bonds, provided entertainment for all social classes, and reminded everyone of their shared identity as Romans under divine protection. As night falls over Rome and families gather at their household shrines for evening prayers, the city settles into sleep under the watchful eyes of the gods who have guided Roman destiny for centuries, confident that proper observance of religious duties will bring continued prosperity and success to the eternal city. Hashtag Chapter 13, Roman Health and Medicine, staying well in ancient times. As Romans prepared for sleep, they might have reflected on their health, something they took quite seriously despite lacking modern medical knowledge. Roman medicine was a fascinating mixture of practical experience, Greek theory, religious belief, and folk wisdom that actually worked better than you might expect. Roman doctors, called medici, were often Greek slaves or freedmen who had learned their craft in the medical schools of Alexandria or Athens. Medicine was not considered a particularly prestigious profession for Roman citizens, but skilled doctors could become wealthy and respected, especially if they served wealthy families or the imperial court. The Romans inherited much of their medical knowledge from the Greeks, particularly the theories of Hippocrates and later Galen. They believed that health depended on maintaining a proper balance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. While this theory was wrong, it led to treatments that sometimes helped, emphasizing diet, exercise, and lifestyle as keys to health. Roman military medicine was surprisingly advanced. Army doctors developed excellent techniques for treating wounds, setting broken bones, and performing surgery. They had to be practical and effective. The Roman army couldn't afford to lose soldiers to treatable injuries. Military hospitals, called valetudinaria, were well-organized medical facilities with separate wards for different types of patients and specialized areas for surgery. Roman surgical instruments were quite sophisticated. Archaeologists have found bronze and iron scalpels, forceps, bone drills, catheters, and other tools that wouldn't look out of place in a modern medical kit. Roman doctors could perform cataract surgery, remove bladder stones, and even attempt brain surgery, though the success rates were understandably low. Pain relief during surgery was limited but not non-existent. Romans used opium, mandrake, and other plant-based drugs to reduce pain. They also understood that alcohol could serve as both an anesthetic and an antiseptic. For minor procedures, doctors might use pressure points or cold to numb the area being treated. Roman pharmacies, called tabernae medici, sold a wide variety of remedies made from plants, minerals, and animal products. Many of these actually worked. Willow bark for pain relief. It contains the same active ingredient as aspirin. Digitalis for heart problems, and various herbs for digestive issues. Roman pharmacists were skilled at preparing complex mixtures and could provide remedies for most common ailments. Public health was an area where Romans really excelled. Their engineering achievements, aqueducts, sewers, public baths, and paved streets, did more to prevent disease than most medical treatments could do to cure it. Romans understood that clean water, proper sanitation, and personal hygiene were essential for health, even if they didn't fully understand why. Roman bathhouses weren't just social centers. They were important public health institutions. Regular bathing removed dirt and parasites. Hot rooms helped with respiratory problems. Cold plunges stimulated circulation, and exercise areas kept people fit. The Romans may not have understood germs, but they correctly observed that people who bathed regularly were generally healthier. Dental care was more advanced than in many later periods of history. Romans had toothpicks, tooth powder made from various abrasive substances, and even primitive toothbrushes. Wealthy Romans sometimes had gold dental work, and Roman dentists could extract teeth and treat some oral problems. However, dental problems were common, partly because Roman tooth powder was often too abrasive and wore down tooth enamel.